Okay, we're going to have a pop quiz this morning. How well do you know your internet slang? But first, I'm going to tell a story about my dear friend Marty. Our families are often together, and we have teenagers, and they were teasing us about not knowing internet slang. Marty was sure she was up to speed. Okay, then what does LOL mean? Little old lady, she said with confidence. Let's see what we've got in the room today. LOL. ROFL. Oh, I was just rolling on the floor laughing. IDK. LMK. NVM. Never mind. EOD. End of discussion. ILY. That's a nice. YOLO. You only live once. FOMO. And the slang term, we got that. And the slang term I learned this week, JOMO. Joy of missing out. The joy of missing out. It is an interesting concept. We can distinguish JOMO from being excluded. The joy of missing out presumes the privilege of inclusion. You were invited to the party, you just chose not to attend, or some circumstance prevented your attendance. This is slang acknowledging the interiority of the introvert. What I most appreciate about the word is that it values experience beyond the normative. The populated experience is not necessarily the most enriched experience. JOMO acknowledges there is always something else going on somewhere else. In the story for this morning, Jacob is trying to get back home. He has been gone from Canaan and living at his uncle's home in Haran for a long time. He left for fear of his life after stealing the birthright of his brother Esau and consequently receiving his father Isaac's blessing. He has gone to his uncle's home in the distant land of Haran. Jacob had everything sorted out in Haran. He had worked hard and earned a buttoned-up life. He had the wife he wanted. He had the next wife that he wanted. He had been fruitful and he had multiplied. He was wealthy. He could have stayed. He could have stayed. But he did not, because even a comfortable exile is an exile. He wanted to return, even though it was dangerous to return. Jacob sends word that he is coming home again, and he learns that his brother is coming to meet him with 400 armed men. 400 armed men is a dangerous thing. Jacob wants to live at home, and there is great resistance. There was resistance then, and there is resistance now. What I mean by that is this is why why most people stay parked at some uncle's house. There is resistance to going home because the spiritual life doing that journey requires something of us. Don't let anyone sell you the malarkey that the spiritual life is peaceful, relaxing, or a walk in the park. Walking yourself home can feel like you've got an army working against you. In our modern culture, the spiritual life is discounted. So not only do you have an army working against you, the world tells you it's not real. When I answered a question once about what I do for a living, a priest, the person said, "Well, isn't that precious?" The spiritual life, if it is acknowledged at all, it's considered a hobby, a special interest, an indulgence, which is why I often respond, I'm a yoga instructor. Saints and gurus and Jesus all remind us of the danger of being asleep at our own life. Jacob was an old man, but he woke up to where he needed to be in the world. He was not at home. Though everything was comfortable where he was not at home. So Jacob packs up and he heads out because there is something essential and he must get himself to it. I think you are here today, like me, because you know where your home is, where you are trying to go. Jacob knew the place, and we know the place. Unfortunately, Christendom in the West has not been much help getting us there. Religious life in the West is based on an understanding of the faith. In most Western traditions, the faith of a particular denomination is based on a set of statements that you believe. You agree to believe this, and you join up. The Episcopal Church has its version of this outlined in the Book of Common Prayer beginning on page 843. There it is. It's called an outline of the faith. The Catechism, 18 pages of Q&A. And literally, if you turn to page 843, it's Q, A, the faith all nice and tidy in question and answers. And then there is another dozen or so pages of historical documents. But the rubrics, it's an Episcopal word, that's the teeny little small print in the prayer book, tell us the real story. It's like you reading along and you actually read the footnote and you're like, the real information in this book is in the footnotes. The real information in the prayer book is sometimes in the rubric. Episcopalians, be it known that the church declares that the catechism is only a commentary on the faith. It is not the faith. Our doctrine is not our faith. What any one of us believes is not the faith. Newcomers are often baffled by the response they get, at first at least, when they ask what it is Episcopalians believe. And I say, we believe a lot of different things. A woman last year said to me, how in the world does that work out? It's very curious. But you do not have to believe in the virgin birth, life after death, the bodily resurrection, to be an Episcopalian. It is not what we believe that holds us together, but what we experience around the holy table that makes us church. Doctrine will never lead us back home. We belong to our religious experience, not our religion. Which brings me to Moby Dick. It is one thick, dense book. Who's read it? Anyone? Okay, good. There are two ways to read Moby Dick, and one way not to read Moby Dick. You can read it start to finish, which means you read both the exciting narrative chapters that capture the adventures of the characters hunting the great whale, and you read the whaling chapters, the tedious chapters that describe the activity of the whale and the process of whaling. Most readers, telling the truth, skip the whaling chapters, which is the second way to read it. Some literary critics will take issue with me, but one can understand the power and glory of the story without the digression of the whaling chapters. What you cannot do when you read Moby Dick is only read the whaling chapters. Then you know everything about whaling, but nothing of the adventure. Jacob knew the way home. He took the adventure. He knew how to get his family back to Canaan. He knew the steps to take. He knew he could get there. But he realized that it was not a place on a map that he was after to get home. There was a place inside of himself he needed to traverse before he could get to home. The story says Jacob got up, he took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, his 11 children, and they crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and he sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had, and then he was left alone. There's a story about Carl Jung on a train with a posse of friends. They are meant to go on vacation together. On the train, Jung is overcome with a sense of immediacy, a subject bearing down on him, something of ultimate importance to him. We never learned what it was. But he leaves the train at the next station and returns home. When his companions are critical of him, he says he had no choice. He was meant for another destination. Jacob is meant for another destination. He's alone. The Bible is not really clear who Jacob is wrestling with. Jacob believes it is some form of God. The tradition calls it an angel. Jung said he was wrestling with his own ego. What it comes to is this: a transformation is required for Jacob to return. He has to leave everything at the other side and cross over, and he wrestles the forces into a new day. And the next morning, he is limping. My friends, the spiritual life will change you. If it's not changing you, then there's something maybe that needs to be happening. It will wrestle you into more of your own being. This is why we read about the saints praying for illnesses, because it wrestled them into more of themselves. It wrestled them into a blessing. Jacob wrestled himself into a new name. To get a name in the ancient world was to know the essence of something. We remember this. Jacob is given the name Israel, which means to struggle with God. There's that, but also Israel was to be the name of the whole people of God, all the people of God. Jacob's work, Jacob's wrestling with himself was not just about himself. It became the work of a nation. It became the work of all the people. Jacob's return to his home was not just his own return. And our own return is not just our own return. His story became the story of a nation, and our spiritual returns become the story of our own day. One of the central characters in Moby Dick is Queequeg, a tattooed South Sea Islander, the son of a chieftain who has left their island home to explore the world. Herman Melville described Queequeg's island home as not a place down on any map, because true places never are. We have a glimpse of the true place as a church at communion. This is what we experience. This is our religion in the Episcopal Church, is this sacrament. At communion, we come together and we receive it with good hearts. And then we did that for a long time, years, building up the good heart in this place. And then one of our spiritual directors said we might consider receiving the bread of Christ by saying, I am. Say, do an Iona. So we gather around this table, the bread of Christ, and people say, I am. And then one among us said one day, the bread of Christ, we are. Our individual blessing of I becomes the blessing of all of us. That is church. That is what we believe. So we start with ourselves, we get ourselves to the table, and then the table goes beyond us into one another. Early Christians did not call themselves Christians, they called themselves the people of the way. We know a new way, like Jacob. There's a new way. One writer recently described it as a Christianity that has yet to be tried. I invite you to get on the train with us at St. James. We are trying a Christianity that has yet to be tried, living into community in ways that we anticipate being surprised by, opened up to, and held in. A faith that's not on any map, but true places never are. Amen.